was actually the fourth covenant with God, three of them being the time of Moses, the fourth being with Joshua after they entered the land to initiate the conquest of the land of Canaan. This is very important because this discussion of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal serves as a linchpin toward the beliefs of a group called the Samaritans. Now the Samaritans, for those who don't know, are an interesting group who claim that they came from the northern kingdom and remained behind when the Assyrians overran the land, and they remained in the area called Samaria, and they were not exiled with the Judean exile under Nebuchadnezzar. When the Israelites came back, when the Jews came back to Judea, the Samaritans wanted to participate with them in the development of Jerusalem, and they were rejected. They considered this an affront, and that created the enmity between the Samaritans and the Judeans that continued on during the Greek period and the Roman period, and which they were perfidious to the Jews and saw them as occupiers, and certainly people who had rejected them for no reason, for improper reasoning. That's their history and their form. The scholars would like to accept at least part of the Samaritan claim, but let me explain what the Judeans say about these people, the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a group who came from the area in Assyria, northern Assyrian empire called Kutia. The Kutians were exiled from their place. They were apparently rebellious lot, and the king Shalmaneser, or later on it was Sargon, Esarhaddon, those people, those kings of Assyria, they exiled the northern kingdom, and in their place replaced them with this rebellious lot from Kutia. That way they got rid of two rebellious lots at the same time, because people who were in a different land were generally more pliable to accept the rule of the emperor as opposed to when they were on their own land and the emperor was trying to impose taxes and other things upon them. That said, this group was at first idolatrous in practice according to the TaNaCh, according to the Book of Kings, and they were not successful. Supposedly there were lions that came and attacked them while they were working the land. In those days, lions existed, mountain lions or real lions existed in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, and in the land of Israel. So they sent a message to the king of Assyria saying that this was not a very good land that he gave them, and they wanted to go back. The king of Assyria sent them a message that maybe they had angered the god of the land, and it was their job to find out what exactly the god of the land wants them to do. They hooked up with some of the remnants of the tribes, of the 10 lost tribes. They had their own priests who taught them the ways of the Torah, and they accepted the Torah, but they had, outwardly they accepted the Torah, but they also had idolatrous practices together with that. And so begins the debate about the identity of the Samaritans. The so-called scholars will tell you that the Samaritans either were from the northern kingdom or they were Judeans that were rejected by Ezra, and they didn't begin their identity until around the 5th or 6th century before the Common Era, and they were a breakaway group, and the Torah that they had was similar to the Torah that the Jews had developed under Josiah's rule. And the reason why I say this in this week's Torah portion is because this week's Torah portion tells you about the primacy of Mount Gerizim, that Mount Gerizim is supposed to have the blessing directed toward it. So they postulated that Mount Gerizim was the place of God's blessings and put a temple there to compete with the temple in Jerusalem. Now, that's the so-called scholars' version. The traditional Jews who aren't really scholars. I mean, after all, I studied the Torah all my life, but I'm not a scholar. I'm just an idiot. I'm somebody who doesn't understand things. The actual documents from the kings of Assyria prove, without a doubt, that the Torah, that the TaNaCh, the prophets' accounting is absolutely 100% accurate. That these were not an indigenous group of 10 lost tribes or a breakaway group from the Judeans, but rather these were a different group. The king Shalmaneser and later on Sargon stated emphatically that they had removed the northern kingdom from controlling the area called Samaria. They destroyed their fortress and repopulated them elsewhere in exile, and took the group from the northern part of their kingdom and placed those people into the land of Samaria, exactly as it says in the book of Kings. Now, for those of us who believe we don't need another document, for those of you out there that need to have verification on everything, the documents indicate exactly what the Tanakh says. So why did the scholars continue the disagreement? Because they don't want to believe that the Tanakh is correct. They want to believe that Tanakh was made by men who rewrote history. As my friend Brian, the hero, says to me thousands of times, we rewrote it. It was rewritten. How come the document is exactly as it says in the book of Kings? And the answer is because it's right. The same thing happens with many of the assertions of the Bible critics who claim that these things were fabrications. They claim that when Chizkiah says he made a tunnel 1,200 cubits long under the rock in order to protect the city against attack, so that they could have a water supply, and that the water supply wouldn't go in the hands of the enemies. So he diverted some of the brooks or some of the natural springs into the Temple Mount underground. 1,200 cubits. And Wellhausen said that this is just a fantasy. Of course, Wellhausen wasn't around when they discovered the tunnel, which is 1,777 feet long, almost exactly 1,200 cubits. Now, 1,200 cubits would be about 1,890 feet long, because our cubit, our measurements are that way. But the cubit is based upon the average height, or the average size of the person. First of all, 1777 is a good approximation, but besides that, the people were probably were quite smaller, and so the cubit was closer to about 18 inches, and so there would be a disparity of about 100 feet, which is what it actually takes place. And so this pronouncement by King Chizkiah is labeled as a fantasy, is there when there's a discussion as to the fate of Sanherib. That Sanherib was, according to the Tanakh, according to the Book of Kings, was murdered by his two eldest sons. This was considered fantasy by the Wellhausen group also, because they had the annals of the kings of Assyria, and nowhere does it say that that Sanherib was murdered, assassinated by his two oldest sons when he tried to offer them to the gods if the gods would protect him from the masses upset over the fact that all of their children had died in the war against the Jews. And this is reported in the Book of Kings, and they of course say that from the annals of the Assyrian kings, it doesn't say anything until they unearthed the diary of Asa Hadon, the personal diary of Asa Hadon, who was the heir of Sanherib, and he writes emphatically that his brothers, Sharetzer, and I forgot the other one's name, went and killed his father and then ran away. So the Assyrian capital was 300 or 400 miles north of Judea. There's no way that person there would know what was written in the personal diary of Asa Hadon as opposed to what's written in the historical books and historical records of the Assyrians themselves. And so the only way for them to know it is by prophecy, recorded in the Book of Kings. Soon afterwards, the Assyrian capital fell, and all of the documents were lost. They were covered up by rubble. They were later discovered, of course, by archaeologists. So now, ask yourself this. The Book of Kings is right regarding the tunnel of Chizkiah. The Book of Kings is right against the scholars regarding the children of Sanherib. The Book of Kings is also right regarding the identity of the Shemronim, or the Samaritans. So why do the scholars insist that Bible criticism is true and the biblical adherents are wrong? Ask yourself that.